Coming back to the beginning of your collaboration, how did you guys meet, or how did you find each other?
Well, when the invitation came from you all, I had just finished my master's program at UC Berkeley, and there were so many interesting scholars there that I sort of thought it would be fun to continue working with, but ultimately my interest in food was sort of at the forefront for me, and I was talking with a friend, Melinda Stone, who, you know, just saying, like, I want to work with someone who's invested in food, but also invested in meaning around food, not just sort of, you know, technique or, and she immediately handed me Jessica's book, and I had heard of Jessica as the chef at the Headlands, and people had mentioned the dinners that she had done around this idea of the full moon feast, and I picked up the book like the next day and was really taken with it. And so I reached out to Jessica to see if she'd be interested in making something in a museum together.
And what did you think when you got when Helena approached you?
To me, it was a great opportunity to just step out of my normal frame of mind and way of thinking, and I've thought of it as like getting to play artist for a few months, which has been really fun.
So Helena, I really liked that you kind of mentioned that actually Jessica's book was kind of a seed that brought you guys together, because books have actually figured very prominently in this project. I think you both did a lot of reading, but you know, as I was kind of waiting to hear how the project was coming, how the collaboration coming, the very first thing I heard was, oh, we're reading The Ohlone Way together. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to that and what your conversations were like coming out of that.
Yeah, well, I think the first time Jessica and I met, we, you know, I tried to give her a sense of the things I was working on and interested in, but also leaving it really open. I didn't want to come to her with too specific an idea, and after that, when we talked a little bit more about this idea of Havruta and that a text, you know, could be the anchor for our work together, Jessica sort of just casually said that she was reading The Ohlone Way, and I had picked it up before and actually had met Malcolm Margolin, the author, before. And so it really was just, you know, what she was reading at the time, and it seemed like a good place to start by reading the book together and seeing and having conversations about how we related to the text. So it was a very casual decision in a way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so what were some of your first conversations like? Were you very closely referring to the text, or were they more broad, do you feel like?
The first conversation that we had, we sort of just was a kind of get to know you conversation, but what's interesting is that what came up in that first conversation was this whole idea of, so for me, because my life is so busy and so full, I needed to feel like there was something really relevant that we were working on. Like, it had to be like, this is really juicy for me. And Helena had read my book, but my book came out in 2006, and so it's not really what's juicy for me now. It was what was juicy for me in 2003, 2004, 2005, leading up to it. And so I felt the need to sort of put out there what I'm interested in right now, because if we didn't work with that stuff, then I wasn't going to be able to muster the energy for it, was sort of, I guess, to put it bluntly, the way that it felt. And so I said, you know, what's really compelling for me right now, or what I've been really thinking about a lot, is all the things that happen and that need to happen and that are so important but are so unseen. The things, and a lot of it for me had to do with where my business was at, and that we had been just doing a huge amount of really difficult work, and it felt all very subterranean. It felt like building the root system, and that we weren't fruiting. You couldn't see what we were doing, but it was all really important. But it was like, it was the underground, subterranean work. And so that was our first conversation, was sort of about that, and we started talking about all those things. You know, my book really references the moon a lot, and the moon is kind of another one of those things that sort of is the opposite of the sun in some sense. It's not the thing that's illuminated, the thing that we know, and the night is, you know, when most of us are sleeping, and there's all the stuff that happens at night it's not so conscious. So it was kind of about what's unconscious or what's unspoken, what's unrecognized, what's invisible, what's unseen, and that was what was really sort of juicy for me. And the Ohlone Way just tied in because part of what is so compelling to me, so interesting to me about traditional cultures and sort of like pre-industrial cultures, but also even sort of hunter-gatherer types of frameworks, is how present spirit is and how absolutely constantly alive everything is that we don't see in our culture. You know, all that stuff is it's just completely recognized throughout the day, like throughout in every single way. And that's really inspiring to me and moving to me. And so in an email, I just mentioned I was reading The Ohlone Way, and she's like, oh, I've been reading The Ohlone Way. You know, I think she had kind of put it down, and then she went back to it. And again, it was just sort of this touchstone of another way of looking at the world, which then sort of blossomed into a lot of conversations about particularly California indigenous history, and how much of that, you know, the land that we stand on has this amazing history that we don't see, that we don't recognize in any way from day to day. And so there's all these spirits, there's all this history, there's all this stuff, and it's just like, where is it? Like, it's been made pretty invisible.
For me, kind of watching your process from the outside and kind of checking in and seeing how things were progressing, there was a lot of kind of negotiating between the two of you of like where you wanted to land on these topics. And then about a month ago, it was like all of a sudden I was being inundated by like all the things that you were going to do, and it was really exciting. But I'm just kind of curious, like, was there a point where things really came together for you?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think both Helena and I are very serious, and we're and I think we also have, you know, we tend to fret, you know, like, and yeah, I mean, it's similarly, it was just sort of like, I mean, I feel like in every aspect of my life, where I'm at is all about learning to trust the process, and I mean, everything's all about my relationship to control and letting go of that. So this was just, okay, another opportunity to practice what I'm practicing everywhere, you know, which is totally great. And yet you just, like, the case looms, like, what's going to go in the case? And because I don't work as an artist, a visual artist in any way, of making things, I mean, I make food all the time, and then you eat it, and it's done. It's not, it can't go in the case. And in fact, you told us very early on, like, it's like, I don't know, because of museum rules, you can't just put food in the case. Because I was like, we'll put a bowl of bay nuts. That's all I could think of. So I really did have to do a lot of trusting, but also, I think really what was sustaining was the dialogue, and was the interaction, and yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in what sort of blossomed out of it.
Yeah, well, in my mind, the breakthrough was kind of when we had a phone conversation, and I was trying to kind of maybe get across to Jessica the way that this could be art without being maybe art in the way we traditionally think of it. And I had done a project with kids where we did this sort of crazy turned upside down restaurant, and I had shown them Fluxus scores as a way of thinking about you know, how to kind of work with instructions and change our habits through these sort of alternative ways of doing normal things. And so I had referred Jessica to take a look at Fluxus in terms of thinking about like what a recipe could be beyond what she does all the time in her work as a chef. And that seemed to kind of click in terms of her being able to write, but in a way that she didn't get to normally in her day-to-day.
And so maybe tell us we've talked about what led up to the dinner, but so what was the dinner?
I guess the 3 courses maybe came out of a combination of some of the dye techniques I was thinking about for the tablecloths, but then also the recipes that Jessica was coming up with. So I think when you started to get the deluge of ideas was when we started to have like a real generative back and forth of like, well, I'm thinking about doing this with the tablecloth, and then that might maybe spurred another recipe, and then the recipe spurred me to think of another ceramic piece to make, and so there was sort of all these things developing at the same time. So we all sat around this table, and it was documented from above in time lapse, and the different ceramics were used in different ways. The first tablecloth was dyed in red cabbage, and we ate things that had to do with reading the Ohlone Way, but also had to do with revealing this sort of acid, the pH sensitivity of red cabbage dye, where it turns dramatically, pink fuchsia with acid and a kind of greenish blue with a basic alkali solution. So we didn't give them any utensils, so they had to be messy. The holes that I had, or the plates I had made, had holes to allow the dressing to seep through the plates. So again, this sort of a kind of defamiliarization of the table, of what can become very habitual, in our sitting down at a table, was part of what drove the different elements of the meal.
So the second course, there was an undyed tablecloth. It was just a white tablecloth, and the idea was that we would cook with candles, and that the candle wax would drip all over the white tablecloth, and then would get dyed in an indigo vat after the dinner. So remember, it's called grief soup, and it's possible that I'll cry. I'll try not to, but it's possible. Cut the onions in such a way that you start to cry. Using a dull knife can help. Chopping irregularly with lots of smashing and bruising will release tear-inducing propanethiol S-oxide, a gas that reacts with the water in your eyes to create stinging sulfuric acid, hence the tears. Melt the ghee in a pan. Contemplate the Sanskrit word for fat, sneha, which also means lavish love or motherly love. Think about how true good fat is like true good motherly love, rich and unctuous, soothing and completely satisfying. If the love you got from your mother was lacking this quality, keep crying. This deep and profound loss needs to be grieved thoroughly and deeply so you can become present to the love that others offer you now. Add the onions to the ghee and stir. Cook until translucent. Add the nettles to the pot. There are 2 ways to do this. The first is very carefully using a pair of tongs so as to avoid getting stung. This will save you some physical grief, but also feeds the belief that pain can be avoided if we're assiduous and careful. This illusion causes more grief in the long run, so a second option is to let yourself get stung as you add the nettles. Mull over the fact that life is inherently full of pain and suffering and loss. The more we close our hearts to feeling this pain, the more we shut off the flow of life that wants to move through us, awakening us to the miracle of being a human on this planet. Stir the nettles and add the dandelion leaves. Let yourself taste one of the strands and feel yourself wince a little from its bitterness. You guys are going to have a chance to do this tonight, too. Try with all your might to love the bitterness. Let yourself cry with the bitterness. Let yourself long for sweetness instead, if that's how you feel. Peel and cut the potatoes. Think about all of the infinitely diverse cultures that were thriving in the Americas at the time of European contact. From the Andes, where potatoes were first cultivated, to the Amazon, the jungles of the Yucatan, the Great Plains of North America, and the Arctic in the north. Think about all of the languages that were spoken, the stories that were told, the wisdom about animals and plants, and the sacredness of rivers, mountains, creeks, rocks, and trees. Think about the acorns that were shaken from trees, and the corn that was planted, and the quiet necessary to hunt an Arctic seal. Think about the abundance of salmon who made a great journey out to the ocean and then returned to the exact stream where they were born to lay their eggs. Think about multitudes of bears getting fat from this salmon and from berries and wild honey, and wolves that traveled in packs and howled at the moon together at night, Imagine all the stars that were visible at night and how the continents pulsed with wildlife and communities of humans dancing with the universe, day in and day out. If thinking about all of this fills you with great grief for what has been lost, invite that grief in. Add the potatoes to the pot along with the chicken broth and bring to a simmer. Cook everything until it is tender, and then puree with an immersion blender, adding milk as necessary to thin, and salt and pepper to taste. Consider that separateness is an illusion. Wait to eat until you have stopped crying. Serve with a big dollop of creme fraiche or sour cream and crispy pieces of bacon. That's the recipe.
There were a lot of tears around the table during that course, and we invited the as everyone ate their grief soup, we invited everyone at the table to share some grief. So it was a very beautiful moment in the meal. In the final course, we had 5 plates that each had a different food on them, and we asked everyone at the table to ask for what they wanted from the other people at the table, because we didn't all have a little bit of everything. We each had something different. And they were foods that had sort of varying economic and maybe aesthetic value to them, in that pork liver mousse, for example, some people find very disgusting and others consider it a delicacy. Or black-eyed peas at one point were considered unfit for human consumption, just, cattle fodder. Those trades that happened at the table were traced by cotton string dipped in iron, which reacted with the onion skin tablecloth in that final course. The objects and the tablecloths that acted as a form of documentation in the videos is what you see out in the hallway.